Energy Media readers, if you're on Twitter, you may have read tweets from Professor Melanee Thomas, who's a political scientist at the University of Calgary, about an op-ed that she and a colleague wrote for CBC a few days ago. And it has a pretty good insight into why we have people who are not following the recommendations of doctors and others to self-isolate and do the things that need to protect all of us during this pandemic. So to discuss that, Professor Thomas, welcome to the interview.
Thanks for having me.
So give us the nickel tour of your op-ed.
So we use Elinor Ostrom's work. She was a political scientist, but she was also the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in Economics for her work on the tragedy of the commons. I'm not going to get into what the tragedy of the commons is. At its core, it's about, we use her work on different reactions to social norms to figure out how we've got different people who are reacting to the public health advice around COVID-19. And so the short version is that most people are willing participants if they are presented with a good argument about what we should be doing and why we should be doing it. And there's lots of open communication around this. The majority, like a super majority of folks are like, got it. I'm prepared to work in a collective interest, or I'm prepared to see my interest as a collective interest. And as a result, this is why you get most people kind of falling in line with those rules. But it's about, we figure it's about 2/3. And so this still leaves a big sizable chunk of folks. Some people are altruists. They're just always going to do the right thing. They're the ones that are like baking bread for people and like sewing masks for free, things along those lines. The other two groups are the rational egoists, who are, they're, for lack of a better term, selfish. So what's really important about Ostrom is that she was the first person in like a behavioral economic sense to point out that most people are not rational egoists. Most economics research prior to this and most behavioral research just assumed that everybody was a rational actor, self-interested and only out for themselves rather than looking out for, it's like a collective good. And Ostrom points out that actually the majority of people aren't this, but this still means that there are these rational actors who are super selfish.
Okay, so I get that, and I see that on social media all the time, that you know, people who are, an acquaintance of mine owns a farm, and he's worried that if he's shut down, that he will be ruined financially, and so he's worried about himself and his financial prospects, and so he supports reopening the economy as soon as possible. Is that a rational egoist, or are we talking about something completely different?
So I would actually say it's a little bit different, where a rational egoist wouldn't follow rules that are being set out unless they are convinced that it's in their selfish self-interest to do it. So a rational egoist, you could say, stay at home and wash your hands. Otherwise, you're going to get sick, and that's going to be very bad for you as an individual. That what doesn't work for a rational egoist is we're all in this together. Like, you don't want to infect your neighbor. They're going to be like, I don't care. But when you say to a rational egoist, these are the things that you need to do to protect yourself, that's when they're going to be persuaded to actually follow the rules.
Gotcha. Now I understand. So how big is that cohort in, say, the the Canadian population?
So we have rough estimates on this, and I should preface this by saying we don't actually have data, particularly about reactions to COVID-19 and things. And this is why we think the importance rests on social norms, because willing participants, so people who could be persuaded to follow the rules, the majority of people, if they see people not following the rules, because they're usually selfish egoists who have been persuaded that it's like in their best interest to flout the rules and just do whatever, willing participants will follow them. And so this is where, if you've got the social norm where there is some kind of, so egoists will need the sanction to follow the rules. And so like, this is one of the reasons why we got things like fines for not following the rules, things along those lines. And so that brings the egoists in line. That means that more willing participants are going, it's reinforcing the message. So they're seeing that. And as a result, you've got more people following the rules.
So if I understand your argument correctly, if the policymakers and those of us who are following the rules need to address the rational egoist, this person who just isn't going to follow the rules because they don't see it in their self-interest, in a particular way. So are fines and other punishments, that's going to do it for the rational egoist?
So in general, what you need to do is to understand that if a selfish person can be made to think that it is in their selfish interest to follow the rules, they'll follow the rules. So egoists need boundaries in their behavior. Most people don't, but most people, if they see people who are not following the rules, will it's kind of like a monkey see, monkey do kind of thing, right? And so the other group that we haven't spoken about are the punishers yet. And so there are people who are following the rules, but also get particularly exercised at the idea of other people breaking the rules. And so they'll take a cost to themselves to punish the rule breakers. This is why you've got things like snitch lines, stuff like this. So I'm not saying that anybody who wants to call a snitch line or shout at somebody in the street who's not following the rules, or want to sanction somebody for violating these social norms, they're not all punishers. Altruists and willing participants also get angry about this stuff as well. But the presence of the rules puts appropriate boundaries onto the egoists. And those sanctions do need to be, they need to be seen to be applied for everybody else to follow line too.
Okay, I'm trying to make sense of this for our readers. So if I understand this correctly, the carrot is you persuade the rational egoist that in fact following the rules is good for him or her.
Yes,
Not
as an individual.
For all of us, it's good for him or her. That's the carrot. And the stick is the punishment if in fact they don't follow the rules. And if
I might rephrase it. And so the carrot is the kind of we're all in this together for the willing participants. So most people, if you give them the positive incentive, they'll do it. It's like recycling. So people will return their bottles to get the 5 cents back. And some rational egoists will do this, but if you get fined for littering, that's going to be one of the things that gets an egoist to stop littering, right? And so different people, the big point that we want to make is that different people respond to different motivations. And so a complete public policy response has to take all those different motivations into account. And I don't want to be in a position where we end up demonizing the egoists for being selfish jerks, or the willing participants for being sheep. Everybody's got a different role to play in society. And so there's goods and there's benefits that come from having people with these different motivations. Our argument is that we need to understand those different motivations to have a full policy response that's effective.
I would argue, as somebody who's on social media a fair amount, that it also is important to understand so that we can have a more fulsome public discourse over this without doing the usual thing of, separating into two polarized tribes or camps and shouting at each other. And if we have some analysis and, we understand the complexity of this, maybe that will happen. And maybe I'm being too optimistic, but nevertheless, you got to start somewhere.
I mean, I would say on Twitter, if you've got a willing participant that's just I buy that we're in this together and we need to do this for our collective good, that's never going to persuade somebody who doesn't believe that the collective good exists. So people who are going to reject the idea of a collective good, which is a minority, but they're a sizable enough minority that they're loud in some context, they need to be given a different motivation. And so this is one of the reasons where I would say things like social science. So we're political scientists. Ostrom was a political scientist too, that we can't respond to a medical crisis without the science that we bring. Because in the absence of this kind of research, I think it would be difficult for somebody to kind of intuitively figure out that some people can be motivated by a collective thing. Some people are going to be motivated by something selfish. What will happen is that people will overestimate the motivation that applies to them. And so this was one of these things where it's a false consensus effect, where it's this applies to me, so something is wrong with you if it doesn't apply to you. We're forcefully pushing back against that idea.
Now, I've heard Donald Trump described as a malignant narcissist. Would we describe somebody like Donald Trump as a rational egoist?
I would describe him as selfish, certainly. But the other thing I would point out is that there are other social norms that are at play in most social contexts beyond the ones that we highlight in this particular article. So you can have this collective motivation. You can have people who are motivated by their own self-interest. You can have people who are motivated by punishment. But Donald Trump is a good example of how political norms also interact with this. And so what I think we're seeing in the United States is that you've got partisanship, and especially performative partisanship, as a norm that people particularly in partisan, socially sorted communities, this partisan performance is taking precedence, and partisan performance is overriding a lot of this stuff that we're hearing as well. So I've got colleagues in the United States that are very worried about the idea that being seen to comply with public health recommendations will identify somebody as a Democrat. And being seen to be worried about the economy is being identified as a Republican. And so there's a couple of other bits of research that are at play here, where when you've got partisanship that becomes polarized and that your social community is tied with your partisanship, what you find is that the issues that people care about follow the party that they belong to, instead of having issue preferences leading you to partisan preferences instead. And so what we're seeing in the US, I worry about this, is that you've got people who are taking cues from the president as a Republican, that this is a hoax, or that this is something that shouldn't be taken too seriously, or that the economics is much more concerning compared to the public health side of things. But they're doing that as part of partisan performance rather than any of the other stuff that we're talking about.
Professor Thomas, this is fascinating and insightful, and no doubt we will be talking to you again before this pandemic is over, should it ever end.
It should.
So thank you very much for that.
Great. Thank you. Stay safe and healthy, all that good stuff.
And the same to you.